To get this agreement, it took a fair amount of compromise by both Alberta and the federal government. It means big shifts on industrial carbon pricing to help get shovels in the ground for a new pipeline by September of 2027. For Ottawa, it means letting Alberta have a much lower carbon price on a much longer timeline. The headline price was previously set to reach $170 per ton by 2030. That is now lowered to $140 per ton by 2040. It's a trade-off the Prime Minister says can work by ensuring this carbon market is more effective, by removing exemptions and regulations that would have allowed polluters to avoid paying the full price. There is also the promise of carbon capture and storage through the Pathways project. Nevertheless, Mark Carney faced questions today about what this means for federal carbon emissions.
What we have today is an agreement between the Government of Canada and the Government of Alberta committing to net zero 2050. Both of us committing to net zero 2050. Not committing in a speech, not committing rhetorically, committing with a series of investments and commitments and market frameworks that are going to move the province, going to move the country towards low emission and to net zero.
Julie Dabrusin is the Minister of Environment, Climate Change and Nature, and she joins me now. Minister, thanks so much for your time today. We appreciate you coming in.
Thanks for having me.
This agreement with Alberta, it includes a lower industrial carbon price, reduced stringency standards to pave the way for a new oil pipeline that will inevitably lead to more oil production and likely more emissions. So does this mean that Canada has abandoned its climate targets?
Well, let's take a step back to actually say what's in this agreement and what it does, because I think this is a historic day for us. So the first part is it does give us a strengthened industrial carbon price. When we first signed the agreement back in November, the credit price in Alberta was trading at about $20, just over $20. And now we actually have a credible path to have an effective price that is 1/6 times that price.
Right.
And beyond that, like as the Prime Minister said, it actually includes putting skin in the game by Alberta and by the federal government with a financial backing to make sure that that actually happens. And it also gets legislated by regulation by Alberta. So that's a strengthened industrial carbon price. It also will level the playing field for renewables by making sure that we can build a clean electricity grid in Alberta. That builds on the electricity strategy that we announced yesterday, which includes a clean electricity investment tax credit that will actually help provinces to build out their electrical grids within the provinces. So there are important parts that are big steps forward on how do we make sure we actually reduce emissions.
Right. Look, and I appreciate it is, in fact, a stronger effective carbon price by 2040 and going forward than it is right now in present day. But on the base headline price, it is lower in 2040 than it was supposed to be to meet your targets under legislation by 2030. So it's a decade delay in hitting that number. And I know it creates an effective carbon market underneath. But the reaction coming in, the Sierra Club calls this a full betrayal. The Climate Institute says 2050 net zero firmly out of reach. Clean Energy Canada says this is a step backwards. And Environmental Defense says it undermines climate goals. So the people who work in this space say this means you can't hit any of your targets.
Yeah, and what I would say is that we are very much committed and remain committed to our Paris target agreement. And also I would go further and say, look, we can have the best plans on paper. But if we're not working with provinces and territories to get it done, if it's not backed by actions, then we're not moving things forward. And where we were in a practical sense was that credit prices were not trading at an effective price. What we have put in place is a system that's actually includes a certainty for industry to be able to look at it and say, we see exactly where the price is going, and we know that there are financial mechanisms and regulatory mechanisms that make it stay in place. So I think that that is actually a step forward, and that's something that they'll be able to actually rely on. And especially as we're looking at how do we build that clean electrical grid? How do we actually move forward with what we need to with renewables?
Look, I get that circumstances have changed, and you were never going to get Daniel Smith on board with the plan as it existed, or Scott Moe, and even Doug Ford in Ontario. There was a lot of pushback and fighting with provinces. And industry didn't like it, and they were finding ways to lower the effective price to a point where it wasn't going to work. But so you've responded to that reality, but we've got no adjustment on emissions profiling, dates for targets? You know, if we can know the price and the stringency going up to 2040, where's the modeling on what this means for emissions?
Well, so the first piece is to say that we do provide emissions reductions plan progress reports, and so all of that modeling goes into it. But when we look at things like even just yesterday was a clean electricity strategy and what we announced is effectively to double the electricity grid, to do it in a way that's affordable for Canadians, and that's really important for Canadians as they look at their energy wallet right now. And it also talks about how do we get to a net zero grid by 2050. We need that stronger grid so that we can electrify our economy, so we can electrify our industry, our transport, our buildings, and all of that is a much larger source of emissions in our country. So we're actually putting in the bones, if I would say, that we can actually build on to make it happen.
But the commitment to 2050 wasn't a net zero grid, it was a net zero economy. And that is not going to happen now, right?
We still are fully committed to our Paris target agreements. So we are still working. I was talking about the electricity grid is,
No, I
is a
understand
net
the
zero
grid.
But to get to the net zero, the reason why we want to double the grid, the reason that we want to actually make sure that we're getting a net zero grid is because it helps us to electrify the rest of the economy. So if you talk about it, like 50 megatons come from our electricity grid right now, but about 500 megatons comes from industry, transport, and buildings. If we can actually electrify, and that's what we need to do, that's what's happening around the world, that's actually how we move it to reduce our emissions.
No, I understand, but you keep saying that you're committed to the Paris targets. You know, I can say I'm committed to a diet and a fitness plan, but if I skip the gym and I binge eat at a buffet, I'm not doing the job, right? You keep adopting policies that all the climate experts say will make those targets impossible to hit. So how can you be committed to something if you're making these changes? I mean, you've decided to make a trade-off. For affordability reasons, for economic reasons, because of the trade disruptions. I get all of that. Why can't you just spell out to Canadians what that means for the path on the climate front?
Well, what that means is that we're actually doing things differently, no doubt, and there is a different context.
Which means new targets, right?
But,
new timelines.
No, because what I would say is what we still are continuing to do is to actually build the infrastructure and the pieces that we need to make it happen. And that's where I go with, you know, and the Prime Minister alluded to this and said it, I believe, in his speech yesterday anyway, which is the best laid plans on paper don't amount to as much if we don't have the actions. And what I would say is when we looked at the National Inventory Report for 2024, which is the last, that's the most updated one that we have, we see that all of the past regulatory pieces that we had in place had done a really important job under the past Liberal government for reducing emissions from what the Conservative government had left us. But it also showed that in 2024, it had started to plateau in where it was going. We were actually not continuing on reductions.
But that's why you were bringing in the oil sands emissions cap, the clean electricity regulations. You were going to have the industrial carbon price ramp up. I mean, there was a plan where you were going to get within striking distance of the 2030 targets, and it's been largely unspooled over the past year.
Well, and the last time I talked to you about how we actually had introduced an enhanced methane regulation. So we have a stronger methane regulation system right now, and we have expanded it to cover landfill, not just oil and gas. So that's actually 400 megatons right there. We now have an agreement on industrial carbon pricing with Alberta, which is, you know, 1/3 of our emissions, right? It's like the large, from a provincial perspective, the province was the largest source of emissions. We actually still have clean electricity regulations, and we have what we have announced yesterday, which is an electricity strategy that helps us to get to electrifying our economy. Those are the pieces that we need in a very practical sense, and I think that's what Canadians want to see us do.
Look, I can see, without question, the gains you are making in real terms with Alberta with this, because they were not going to comply or meet or adjust to what was on paper beforehand. But now other provinces are going to look at this and say, me too. David Eby has already said this makes British Columbia industry less competitive than Alberta industry. Do they get to move to that price? Have you effectively renegotiated industrial carbon pricing for the country with only Daniel Smith at the table?
Well, the first part I'll say is having a strong industrial carbon price in the province, which has, you know, some of the most major projects and is our largest source of emissions on a provincial basis, is a step forward for the country as a whole. And I would add that having an industrial carbon price that's only trading at $20 or just around $20 wasn't going to be very effective for the rest of the country as well.
Understood.
So we did put in a consultation paper at the beginning of this year that will set out how we deal with industrial carbon pricing right across the country. We're going to have to work right across the country to strengthen the industrial carbon pricing system. But I would say this is an important step forward because it creates that certainty.
Right, and I get that. A market has to be credible for it to be effective. So I can see the point on that. But the headline price for carbon, industrial carbon was supposed to be $170 by 2030. Now it's going to be $140 by 2040. David Eby, Scott Moe, Doug Ford, they're all going to want that same plan. Is that where the country is going? Because you talk about scaling this up to a national carbon market, an offset market. Can't do that if everyone's got a different price. So is this effectively the plan for the rest of the country on an industrial pricing policy?
And so let me just answer that like one more time. And when I'm saying that is that we have a consultation paper that's out there right now on how we're going to deal with industrial carbon pricing right across the country. What we had was one province that had an industrial carbon pricing system that wasn't working effectively. We now have changed that, and that is a great sign of how cooperation can work to actually make it work better. And absolutely, what we're going to be doing as next steps is working with all of the provinces and territories to make sure we do have a strong industrial carbon pricing
But will
system.
the principle be equity, the same price? Will that be the guiding principle on it?
The system will always be like fair to all of our regions, but we have to make sure that the next steps, and not just on industrial carbon pricing, by the way, but also in how we're working to make sure we build that strong, clean electrical grid right across our country, which is going to look different in different regions. We're going to have to continue working, but that's, I think, what the Prime Minister certainly is trying to highlight in this work, which is we're trying to be pragmatic, we're trying to be cooperative with our provinces, and we're trying to get things done, because without the provinces, we can't get it done.
Right, so, but this MOU was signed November, right, if I'm remembering the date correctly. So we knew this day was going to come. You're putting significant changes to industrial carbon pricing, which you and others, I believe the Prime Minister, have called the most important climate policy in the toolkit right now. In the biggest polluting province, on the biggest polluting sector, surely you've done modeling on what this means. Like, I can't imagine you would reform the policy framework without running the numbers on the consequences on the climate side. So when do we see that? Why wasn't that released today to show the trade-offs that you're willing to make on this?
Well, first of all, I'll go back to this entire MOU covers much more than the industrial carbon price, but I do think that that's a piece of the success. It also includes, like I said, leveling the playing field for renewables, a commitment to how they improve their grid so that it's a net zero grid by 2050, plus interties with neighboring provinces, plus methane and actually enhancing the methane regulations and how it applies. So there are a lot of different parts to this agreement. But we do put out an emissions reductions plan progress report regularly. And so with the next one, all of that modeling, because it's not just one piece, it's all of the pieces together. And that's what we'll put forward, because we have the auto strategy that we've put out. We have this industrial carbon pricing system that we've been working on. We have our electricity strategy. We have many pieces that have been coming together. That's what we put out when we put out our emissions reductions
But Minister, with due respect, yesterday, the Prime Minister said if this electrification strategy will reduce emissions by this specific number. Today, nobody will give us a number on what this means for the emissions profile of the country. How can you do it on something when it's a reduction, but not offer the same clarity on something that a lot of people say is going to mean an increase?
Right. Well, what we're working on and what we've said is that we're confident that this system is a strengthened industrial carbon pricing system and part of a larger agreement that also works to reduce emissions across our country, quite frankly. Like I said, by increasing the opportunities for interties, which is just connecting provinces on the electrical grid, by improving renewables, by reducing methane, which is the most harmful source of emissions. Like, there are many pieces to this MOU that all come together. And we will continue to work to reduce emissions right across our country. And all of the modeling that comes out to show how all of the plans that we're putting together towards electrifying our economy, that all will come out when we put out our emissions reductions plan, because there are many pieces that have to
So
be
when will we see that?
together.
When will we see that?
On the next date when the progress report comes out, which I believe is a year out. But
Okay.
there are
No, it's just a long time to wait with these changes happening in real time, and a pipeline going to be declared a project of national interest most likely by the fall, right? So the skepticism will persist for a while.
A pipeline that, by the way, very clearly has been said must also include carbon capture and storage with pathways.
Absolutely. So I wanted to ask you about that, because no pathways, no pipeline, no pathways, right? This is the bargain here, that the big investment in carbon capture needs to happen. The documents today say that the emissions reductions for the pathways program will be at about 16 megatons per year when fully implemented, and target date of 2045. If you go on the NRCan website where this project was initially proposed and you look at the past literature coming out of the Pathways Alliance, it was promising reductions of 62 megatons a year by 2050 when it was all done. Why is there a 46 megaton gap between the initial promise and what's in the agreement today?
So what we know is that, first of all, like you said, and I think it's really important to keep reiterating it, that a pipeline only happens if we have carbon capture and storage with pathways. With the pathways piece and carbon capture and storage, that's actually a real opportunity for Canada. The IPCC says it's one of the tools in the toolbox to reduce emissions, and so it is one of the tools that we have. And what we have set it up with this agreement is with targets to reduce emissions that are directly tied to the emissions that would be coming from the pipeline. So it's a thought out plan, and it's a real chance, by the way, for innovation in our country, because it will be one of the largest carbon capture and storage facilities in the entire world.
But that delta, that gap of 46 megatons, that's roughly equivalent to the 50 megatons I think the Prime Minister said the electric grid was emitting every year. So, so that's not an insignificant gap. I mean, can you explain that to me? Why was it initially proposed and floated at 62 megatons by 2050, and now the target is 16 megatons by 2045?
Yeah, so the way that the whole project is set up, and this is tied to the pipeline directly as to the way that it would work, and it is supposed to, I believe the numbers say, offset 90% of what the emissions would be from that pipeline. But it is going to be one of the world's largest carbon capture storage facilities, which is actually great news for our country, because that is one of the sources of innovation. It's one of the places where, when we look at clean tech companies around the world, Canada consistently places at the top with carbon capture. So it's a real opportunity for us to also develop that technology, create more jobs here in Canada.
Okay, one last question, Minister, because we've gone over time. Do you expect people like Stephen Guilbeault to remain in your caucus based on what was laid out here today? Because a lot of this seems to cross red lines that he has laid out publicly in the past number of years.
Look, this is a really important agreement for Canada. This is a chance to show how we can work cooperatively with different provinces. Look, all of the work that we did under the previous Liberal government is a stepping stone that we worked on to get to where we're at today. And now we get to move forward further, and that's by taking actions and working cooperatively with provinces. And I think that's something that our entire caucus can get behind, is the idea that we're going to be working cooperatively and keep building our country.
Minister Julie Dabrusin, we appreciate your time on a busy day. Thanks so much.
Thank you.